Today's date is 10/7/21. We're at the Evansville Wartime Museum, and we're going to have James Zumwalt talk. This is a crowd. It's a joint effort of SWRCA and the Evansville Wartime Museum, and these are Evansville residents here getting ready to hear the man. He's James C. Zumwalt, and we're going to have an introduction here in a minute. Thank you for watching this video, but this is going to be a great day with Admiral Zumwalt's son, Admiral Elmo Zumwalt's son, James Zumwalt, going to talk today. Thank you very much. And we have two Vietnam exhibits up there donated by David Cates and also C. Larry Rhodes.
To say that if it wasn't for Mark, we would not be meeting here today. So we thank you. Mark, it's yours. Is Kristen Hood here? Kristen, do we have some of those handouts? Can you put one at each end of each table for us? What Kristen is handing out, I have a lot of administrative things to talk about first. So before we get to the main man is James C. Zumwalt. And I'm not going to take too much time, but I do have some administrative things. Number one, this is the Evansville Wartime Museum, and that is a P-47. So glad you're here. I want you to appreciate both of them. Send your neighbors and friends here, and family. We'd love to have them. We have our winter hours. Can you hear me in the back or just bad? My wife Jennifer. Up higher. Okay. Keep giving me signals back there. This Evansville Wartime Museum has been open since 2017. The P-47 has been parked right there since October of last year. So love to have you all be part of this great phenomenon that's happening in Evansville. Now, this exhibit is put up by David Cates and C. Larry Rhodes. They both were managers at Sandy's. Now, Sandy's was a hamburger joint here in Evansville. They've gotten more advanced in their lives since their hamburger days. C. Larry Rhodes is on the back of every park bench, every bus stop in the city for about 4 decades. And David Cates has a hearing aid place, and I know none of you would need that. We have 3 other new exhibits. We have 5 new Vietnam exhibits, and this James C. Zumwalt has stimulated us that. The 3 exhibits in the back, one of them is of North Vietnamese uniforms and some paraphernalia. It's well done in the back. There's 2 other cases there. One is of a warrior named Stephen Reppett. He is a CPA. He does a lot of volunteer for Bossy Accounting and Bossy Mathematics. He is a Bossy graduate. His dad was a graduate or a teacher there. In that same case is Larry Head. He was busy with nuclear things in the 60s. And remember, we're going to talk about Vietnam, but there was something in the background called the Cold War. And so he was a nuclear person, and that was all going on behind the scenes, and we didn't unleash any nuclear weapons during this Vietnam event. There's another exhibit. It's all behind that Higgins book there. There's another one's by a guy named Bill Schuster, who died a couple years ago. He was a USMC Semper Fi, the nail. And next to him is another gentleman. He is here. He's in the back row here. His name is John Bishop, and he went to Bossy as well, and he ate nails too. He now eats regular food. But on the top cabinet back there, he has a M14, and this is an M16 up here, and that was every Vietnam soldier knew what an M14, M16. It was a precursor to the M16, and he's put that on loan to the museum, and his wife wants him to loan it permanently, but he wants to loan it temporarily. But anyway, that's what I want you to mosey around and look at. There's a gentleman standing in front of the P-47. His name is Richard Yeager. He's not Chuck Yeager's relative that I know of, but he is a pilot. And we have a new, back in the back, way back in the cool area, we have a simulator room, and he has 3 simulators going, and he's the pilot who's going to teach you how to fly. Earl Fetcher here is one of the most senior pilots in town. He may help us too, but I don't know if he will or not. But we have 3 simulators. We had 13 of you participate last time. They don't have their license yet, but they were good flyers. 3 of you. Mr. Tomes, Senator Tomes couldn't come, but his brother-in-law is here, and they flew pretty well. These 2 guys right here, they flew pretty well. They don't have their license yet, but they're working on it. Anyway, but that's open to you to learn to fly, and you can't crash, you can't get hurt in a simulator. Just so you know, you will still live if you crash. What this young lady, Kristen Hood, this is sponsored by SWRCA and the Bronstein Foundation. That's who's paid for your lunch. And she handed out some things because we have to think about next month. I know, James, I'm getting to you here in a second. But next month on 11/4/21, so my wife doesn't have to do too much paperwork. If you want to come, it's Thursday, 11/4/21. We will have a stage up here, and we will have 3 gentlemen up here. And you will win a door prize. The door prize will be a free pass to hear 1 hour of a simulator with Richard Yeager if you win the door prize. The door prize is to guess the oldest individual's age, exact birth date. 3 men will be up here, and you have 1 out of 365 chance of winning this prize. Because I'm going to tell you, they're all between 98 and 99 years of age. They can all walk and talk, think, and hear at 99. And they're going to be on the panel discussion. So if you sign up, you get a free lunch, and you get to be here next month on 11/4/21. I'm not trying to upstage you now, Jim, okay? But those guys are 2 years younger than his dad, and his dad would be 101 right now, that you're going to hear about Admiral Zumwalt. Now, that's some of the preface, and we'll get to Admiral Zumwalt's son in just a minute. I had a picture up here, and the computer went dead. Let's see if it'll open up again. Now, does anybody know what that picture is of? What is that, Susie? Susie is a DAR, so she knows things. She is 100% correct. She says it's a Naval Observatory, and your watch is going according to that. There's a great big telescope behind that building, and that's called the Naval Observatory. This gentleman's dad lived there from 1970 to 74. That home was built about 128 years ago. It's on Massachusetts Avenue. It's one of the prettiest homes in Washington, D.C. Your vice president lives there now. A guy named Happy Rockefeller and Nelson moved into that after Elmo Zumwalt moved out in the mid-70s or so. Ford was supposed to move in there, but we lost Nixon, and so Ford came in. And Ford got to go to the big White House, and so Happy and Nelson got to go in that house. I've got one other slide to show you. I don't know if you're going to talk about it. Let's see if we can get this slide here. Now here's another one. No, I don't want that. That's the Blair House. And I know Susie knows what that is, but we're not going to talk about that. Now, I had a picture of the ship, and the ship is now lost. I had a picture of the ship, and now I'll have to find it. I'll show it to you later. But it was his dad named the ship after him, called the, there we go, Zumwalt ship, okay, whatever. It's a real, I'm going to get that picture up for you in a little while. It's an amazing ship. It was christened about 2016. It's got missiles that come out the side, and you can't even catch it by radar. He'll talk probably a little bit about that. Now, we're going to have James talk in just a second, but I want to tell you a little bit about his daddy. And this is what the talk is about, his daddy named Elmo Zumwalt, Admiral Elmo Zumwalt. He's done an amazing amount of things for our lives, okay? He was my boss, 1970 to 74 when I was Navy. He was Paul Black's boss too. Paul Black was a black shoe in the Navy, and he was his boss. I don't know if they were on first name basis, but he was his boss. He was a little bit lower level than the Admiral. He was a full, 010 or 09 or something, old lot. Some things of what Admiral Zumwalt did that James is going to talk about, but things he probably won't talk about, is number one, he retired in the 80s at age 53, and he was in charge of all the Navy. Men like that don't ever retire, okay? He might have retired, but he did a lot of things for our world after that. He was valedictorian class in high school. Now, I don't know if anybody else was, but he was. That means the highest score. So he's valedictorian 1939. He was in Naval Academy 39 to 43, and in 43, he then went out to war. And he also, from what I can tell, he was at the war in Lady Gulf. Lady Gulf was the biggest naval battle we ever had. We had a talker here about 4 years ago that talked. His name was John Buto. He was there on an LST, and it was sort of our hospital ship. But anyway, he was in Lady Gulf War. But after this General Admiral Zumwalt retired, his son that he's going to talk about a little bit, that I actually was one of the doctors in the clinic when he was there in the 1980s at the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda. He ended up dying of lymphoma and Hodgkin's disease in 1988. But at that time, a very advanced treatment for lymphoma was bone marrow transplant. And Elmo Jr. Elmo III had a twin sister, and she gave her bone marrow to him. It ended up not working, but we use a lot of bone marrows for lymphoma now. And Elmo understood that we need donors. It's called a mud transplant, where we donate somebody else's bone marrow for bone marrow. And he was the first chairman of the bone marrow donation. That started about 1988. So that's a fabulous thing he did. The second thing, if you go to LA and go to VA Hospital, LA West VA Hospital, it's a mesothelioma advanced care medicine hospital named after Elmo Zumwalt. Mesothelioma happens to people that work around asbestos. A lot of schools were filled up, a lot of ships were, and Elmo died of asbestos, died of mesothelioma. So they named that after him. So I can't even tell you all the things that his dad did. And his son's, the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree. So I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm sorry I went so long, but I think you need to know all that. When you get done, I want you to look at these exhibits, and also want you to go back and hang around the seminary room. And James is going to come up here and talk now, and I'm going to get off the microphone. I'm sorry it was so long. James, come on up here. He came all the way up here from Florida. He has 3 new young children, and if any of you want to babysit, he's got 3 children, ages 5, and so he will let you babysit. You only have to go to Sarasota, and you're only going to get paid $8 an hour.
Thank you, Mark. Just for the record, I didn't get these young kids the old-fashioned way. We adopted them. So there are 2 brothers we got 5 years ago, ages 3 and 5, and now 8 and 10. I had 26 years in the Marine Corps. I thought it prepared me for every challenge there was in life, but I tell you, fathering 2 kids at age 72 is full of challenges. Just thank God for tasers. I know that many of you who served in the Navy probably know who my father was and what he did. But for those of you in the other services and wives who may not be as familiar with it, I'm proud to talk about him this morning. And let me start by kind of hitting the high points of what he accomplished. And then what I'd like to do is to go back and share snapshots with you of his life and things that I think will give you a good indication of what the man was all about. My father became the youngest chief of naval operations and senior military man in the Navy in 1970, served for 4 years, retired in 1974. He completely transformed the Navy. There were many challenges that he faced when he came to office. The most pressing two, one was reenlistment. Because of the Vietnam War, the reenlistment rates were at an all-time low in the Navy. So he set up study groups and had each of these study groups focus on different groups that were affected by what was going on, not only in the Times, but within the Navy itself. He had a retention group looking at what some of the issues were for minorities. He had a retention group looking at what some of the issues were for women, why they were getting out. He immediately took these recommendations that the retention groups made and implemented them into the Navy in messages that went directly from the CNO down to the lowest level. It didn't go from one commander down the line to the other, which caused some problems with the senior guard. But he implemented these changes. And for example, Filipinos were, ever since they were allowed in the Navy, were only allowed to serve as stewards. My father recognized that as being unfair. He immediately opened up all ratings so that Filipinos could go into any rating that they wanted. Today, I'm proud to announce that we have 2 Filipino Americans who were flag rated officers. They've benefited from that system. Women benefited immensely. He opened up a lot of opportunities for women that they didn't have before. He promoted the first woman to Rear Admiral, and there was a picture of him in the New York Times awarding her 2 stars, and something that would be inappropriate today, he was kissing her on the cheek. And so a classmate of my father's wrote him and said, but I never thought I'd live to see the day that the CNO kissed an admiral. And my father immediately wrote him back and said, dear friend, you need to know nobody becomes the CNO without having kissed a lot of admirals. So he had a great sense of humor. In December 1970, he was featured on the cover of Time magazine, and they explained how he basically took the U.S. Navy, quote, kicking and screaming into the 20th century, implementing all these changes to help with the retention. He was also recognized after his death by Veterans Magazine on the 100th anniversary of Veterans Day as being one of the 100 most influential military leaders who had served. And finally, on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of Israel, the Israeli embassy came out with a list of 70 people 70 Americans that they felt had contributed to maintaining Israeli security, and he was number 5 on that list. So he was a man of many accomplishments. At his funeral in January of 2000, President Clinton gave a eulogy and described my father as the Navy's conscience. I would suggest that in addition to being the Navy's conscience, he also represented its soul. There's an expression that the soul writes your legacy. And I think we all wonder when we get in our older years what kind of a legacy we're going to leave behind, whether it's one that's going to be erased easily or not. Some of us will have legacies that are written in sand and dispersed with the first wind of the times. Some will have it written in pencil, some written in ink. Some superb individuals will have it written in stone. My father's is written in steel in the form of the USS Zumwalt TDG 1000, the world's first stealth destroyer that was commissioned in 2016. $4.5 billion, represents 10 new technologies, which is very rare for the Navy. The Navy usually introduces a new technology by putting it on an existing platform. But in this case, they took 10 new technologies and incorporated them all into the USS Zumwalt, even the basic frame of the bow. And if you've seen pictures of it, and those of you that are students of the Civil War, remember the Merrimack, the bow of the Zumwalt goes sloped outward rather than sloped inward like the normal bow configuration of a ship. And they discovered that it has a lot more stability that way. It is an amazing ship, and everything is hidden. You can't even see the missile launchers, which are built into the sides of the ship, or the guns. They retract. And the reason for that is it gives the radar a very small image on radar. Interestingly enough, the name of the first commanding officer was Captain James Kirk. So the Navy got some PR out of that. They talked about Captain Kirk finally getting his stealth ship. And ironically, who was at the place? James Kirk. Shatner wrote Captain Jim Kirk a letter saying, "Take good care of my ship." So, and now I understand Shatner's going up to space. So that's part of the evolution for him. But let me share some snapshots about my father. And one thing, as a midshipman, he was known for being quite a practical joker. And one of his classmates, a guy named Ray Angelos, shared a story about how my father was over at the commandant's office, superintendent's office, and was told to take a message back to the dormitory where the midshipmen were. My father raced back to the dormitory, and as he approached some of the rooms, he saw that there were a bunch of midshipmen that were huddled around a room. He looked inside the room, and there was another midshipman who had received from his father a box of grapes. And obviously going through the slow mail process, by the time they got there, they were completely rotten. So my father, Ray Angelos, explains what happened next. He said, quote, "The silver-tongued Zumwalt strode into the room barefooted and immediately launched into an impromptu discourse on the history and art of winemaking in Old Italy. His eloquence held the amazed audience spellbound, and he then announced that they would be treated to an actual demonstration. The grapes were dumped on the polished floor, stomped upon, Bud and his roommates then fled. He then announced that there would be a room inspection in an hour." When my father graduated from the Naval Academy, it was the class of 1943. They graduated in 1942 because they expedited graduation because of the war. Each midshipman had a yearbook called the Lucky Bag. And next picture of the graduate was a paragraph written about the individual by his roommate. The first sentence of the paragraph about my father read, "To Bud Zumwalt, the two most important things in life were women and women." As he got out into the fleet, that very quickly changed. So the two most important things in his life became his sailors and his sailors. And I think there's a bit of irony that the patron saint of sailors is St. Elmo, the same name my father had. My father was immediately sent to radar school. Radar was new to the military at that point in time, and then was put on a ship as a radar officer, going from California to Hawaii, and then on to Pacific to fight the Japanese. And while they were on their way to Hawaii, there was an announcement from the captain, and he said, "Ensign Zumwalt to the bridge." My father came up to the bridge, and the commanding officer was looking at the radar scope, and He said, I can't make out what's here, what is it? And my father looked at the radar scope, and it was something he hadn't seen before, and he's trying to figure out what he's going to say, and he remembered that he was told that sometimes there's something called an atmospheric anomaly that will look kind of strange on the scope. So he sticks his chest out, sir, it's an atmospheric anomaly. Kevin nods, and my father goes back down below. 30 minutes later, Ensign Zumwalt to the bridge. My father comes up, and as he comes to the bridge, he sees convoys of ships passing on either side. These were fortunately American ships heading back to the States. But the CO looked at my father and said, I just wanted you to see your goddamn atmospheric anomaly. It's one of the few mistakes he made in the Navy, but it also told him that to err is human. And that was a lesson he kept with him for a long time. I think one of the greatest testimonials to a leader is what those who served under you remember years later about you. And obviously, those memories can be good or bad. But in my father's case, they were very positive. About a half century after World War II, a radioman third class, Jason Hammer, who had served under my father when he was the onboard a destroyer, wrote an article about my father. Now, let me just share a little bit about what he said. Zumwalt was, he said, the epitome of what an intelligent, good-humored, and efficient naval officer should be, and at the same time, one of the kindest and most considerate men it was my good fortune to have served with. A wonderful human being, deeply dedicated to equality and justice in word and deed for all. While naval protocol effectively stifled meaningful socializing between officers and enlisted men, both accepted it as a fact of life. We were shipmates in the sense that if something went radically wrong, we were all, regardless of rank, literally in the same boat. In any event, socializing with him certainly was not a prerequisite for recognizing that seemingly unflappable aura which seemed to surround him, even under the most nerve-jangling circumstances. That calm command would have been memorable even to someone knowing nothing else about him beyond what they could observe. It left an indelible impression. Anyone dependent on another human being for leadership and in desperate need of some degree of assurance under hazardous conditions immediately will recognize the feeling. Here was a man from whom I repeatedly gained some measure of peace of mind. His quiet strength and obvious calm, whether during torpedo run, kamikaze attack, or retaliatory fire from hostile shore batteries, never failed to reassure me with his always observable control of any situation. Then talking about combat experiences, says strangely, I was not worried. Excited, yes, but not worried. In addition to a heavy sense of adventure which seemed to shield me from the reality of the danger, I totally was reassured by the expected calm efficiency being displayed by the lieutenant. Lieutenant Zumwalt was showing his proven ability to transmit a quiet serenity to everyone around him. His voice always even, his actions always carefully considered and calm, regardless of the urgency of the situation. And the circumstances at hand certainly called for all the calm we could muster. He goes on to talk about the Battle of Lake Gulf, and the ship they were on, the USS Robinson, was involved in that engagement. It was a nighttime battle, and it was the last time in naval history that the tactical maneuver of capping the T was performed. And for those unfamiliar with it, what that is you have an enemy force that is coming up in a column like this. In this case, it was the Japanese battleships. And they're coming this way because they're going through a narrow waterway. And at the same time, you have the American ships that are coming along like this, trying to cap that T. And the reason that gives you tactical superiority is that the American ships could use both their forward and aft guns, whereas the Japanese coming this way could only use their forward guns. So it's not too often that you can get in that situation, but that was the tactic that the Navy battleships were attempting to accomplish as the Japanese were coming up. And my father on the Robinson and a couple other ships They were sent to draw the attention of the Japanese, and so they made a run on the Japanese battleships. The destroyers that had torpedoes. The Japanese finally saw the American destroyers moving in. My father said a round went overhead, a round went in front of him, and he knew where the third round was coming. So he let go of the torpedoes and immediately veered off. And by that time, the American battleships were in position and started engaging the Japanese battleships. As the battle continued, though, there was fire not only coming from the battleships. There were Japanese submarines present. There was hostile fire from the beach. The commanding officer had the con. He was driving the ship. And my father was down below in CIC. And my father looked on the radar. By this time, he knew exactly what was on the radar. And he saw that they were approaching an island. And the commanding officer was so distracted by directing fire at enemy combatants that he wasn't paying attention to where the ship was going. And so Hammer continues to write that my father got on the MC and said, quote, on collision course with Little Hiddleston Island, dead ahead, acknowledge. And Hammer says, approaching the island at 30 plus knots at the approximate rate of 1/2 mile per minute, impact would accomplish what the Japanese failed to do. Quote, a collision at this speed with an accompanying boiler exploding would demonstrate very spectacularly why these ships were called tin cans. He said the lieutenant gave another desperate warning. Quote, bridge, back all engines, emergency full, immediately, you are going aground, unquote. Finally, acknowledgement from the bridge came and immediately ordered all back engines. Hammer said he didn't know whether the command had been given in time. He looked to my father for his normal assurance. Quote, his words were electrifying and anything but comforting. Hang on, this is it. Based on numerous past experiences, if the lieutenant was certain, then I had no doubt whatsoever about the outcome. Sentence had been passed and we awaited the final moment, unquote. Hammer said he then grabbed a steel pole and awaited the inevitable collision. Quote, I prepared myself as best I could for the inevitable impact and turned once again to the lieutenant, fully expecting to see him carrying out his assigned duties right up to the explosive end. He indeed was doing just that, but frankly, I was not prepared for what I saw next. I was looking at a tall, dignified, impeccably dressed naval officer in spotless tans, looking quite militarily proper in every way except, could this be? He had prepared for this inevitable conclusion by pulling his hat down to the top of his ears, with the bill slightly resting above the bridge of his nose. At least his vision was unimpaired, not his dignified appearance. Under less ominous circumstances, I would be desperately trying to suppress an uncontrollable urge to laugh, but understandably, the humor escaped me for the moment. Instead, it occurred to me as a fleeting thought that perhaps his last desire was to die with dignity with his hat on, unquote. Hammer said he, quote, felt the expected thud and ominous scraping beneath their feet before easing to a total stop, followed by dead silence. And then the sounds of the engine coming to vigorous life, straining to free the bow from the clutching coral, unquote. Robinson had survived, and the lieutenant properly adjusted his hat. He concluded, quote, I'm sure he was unaware, despite that dramatic pronouncement of impending disaster, my gratitude for once again supplying the quiet reassurance I so often needed, especially on an unscheduled rendezvous with Little Hiddleston Island. Thanks, Admiral. Well done. My father's first command in the Navy was actually not of a U.S. ship. It was the HIAMS Ataka, a Japanese gunboat. His destroyer had captured it coming out of the Yangtze River, and my father and about 10 sailors were put on board as the prize crew officer of a Japanese crew of about 200. My father was ordered to sail the ship up the Yangtze River, and he would team up with Admiral Marion Miles, who was conducting guerrilla operations behind Japanese lines. However, before they could rendezvous with with him, the Japanese had surrendered, and so his orders were changed to take the ship he was on into Shanghai and start disarming the Japanese. So his ship became the first ship flying the U.S. flag to pull into Shanghai, China, at the end of World War II. And he tells the story of the ship pulling up and tying up, and here on the pier platform were thousands of Japanese soldiers. And it was just my father, the 10 sailors, and then 200 Japanese on the gunboat. They weren't quite sure how the Japanese were going to react. And as my father took one of the biggest sailors with him to walk behind him, they walked down the plank, and as my father got to the end of the plank, the Japanese commander on the pier stood in his way to block it. And my father hit him, threw him to the ground, and the Japanese commander started to go for his pistol when this sailor kicked it out of his hand, picked him up, and threw him down again. And with that, the Japanese soldiers parted a way for my father and the sailor to pass. I guess they either figured these guys were crazy or there's a lot more Americans on there than we realized. But other ships began coming into port after my father got there, and after a couple of weeks, 3 of his fellow graduates of the Naval Academy came to see him, and they said, "Look, we've been invited to a Russian home for dinner, and we understand there's going to be 4 Russian girls there, and we need a 4th to join us." My father, having been at sea for 2 years, they didn't have to ask him twice. And so he went to this dinner with them, and this whole series of events, from the capture of the Japanese gunboat, the pier experience I just shared with you, just going to dinner, was written up in a 75-page letter that my father wrote his father when it was all over with. He would explain what had happened. But in this letter, he explains going to this Russian home, knocking on the door, and he says a middle-aged man answered the door, turned out to be my uncle, and he escorted the 4 bachelors into the dining room. He said here was this beautifully set table, all this Russian food and so forth, and then a side door opened, and an elderly woman, a middle-aged woman, came out, which was my mother's aunt. And he says in the letter, she was followed by 4 beautiful Russian girls. The first one was a statuesque blonde. I saw the second one, my heart sank. I never saw the other 2. So, being a bit of a romantic, I'm sure he did see the other 2. But, the second one was my mother. And my mother spoke Russian and French and very minimal English, and my father only spoke English. It turned out one of the other girls there was bilingual, and so she translated for my parents. They met on the 1st of October, 1945, and my father, at the end of the evening, asked if he could come back and see my mother and have her start to teach him Russian. And so he came back for 6 days. On the 7th day, he proposed, and he did so by quoting Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poem. And in the poem, it says, "Come live with me and be my bride, and leave all the treasures true." But when you're telling this to somebody who doesn't quite understand English, my mother reached back to slap him. She didn't know whether it was a proposal or a proposition. And my father said, "No, I want to marry you." And so she said "da," which means yes. And they were married on October 22nd, so they only knew each other for 3 weeks. And he explains the reason it took so long to get married after he proposed was back then you had to get your commanding officer's permission, and his commanding officer had been married and divorced 3 times, so he tried talking my father out of it. But on their 50th wedding anniversary, we had a big ceremony for them, and when he got up and made his remarks, he talked about that letter he wrote, and said that the music he heard playing when he first met my mother has never stopped. In March of 1951, my father became navigator of the battleship Wisconsin. And for those of you who served in the Navy, as you know, there's one event a commanding officer can suffer that is career-ending, and that's going aground. We have two CNOs who were on board ships that went aground when they were in positions of responsibility. One was Ensign Chester Nimitz. He was on a destroyer that went aground. Didn't hold him back. And the other one was my father. Now, why didn't that end his career? He was a navigator on board the Wisconsin. Captain Kirk was the commanding officer, and they were ordered to tie up to buoys in the Hudson River. And my father was looking at the wind velocity and the waves and so forth, and he warned the commanding officer, those buoys aren't going to hold. And the commanding officer called his superior, and the superior said, look, we had a carrier in there a couple of weeks ago, it'll hold. And so they were ordered to tie up there. Again, my father became very concerned, and again he told the commanding officer, they're not going to hold. Commanding officer again spoke to his superior, he said, look, I'm giving you an order, you tie up those buoys. They tied up, shut down, guess what happened? Buoys started dragging, the ship went aground. And it got a lot of publicity when ocean tugs had to come and pull it off the bank. Interestingly, many years later, after my father had retired, he was having lunch with Donald Rumsfeld. And Rumsfeld, not knowing my father was a navigator at the time, started sharing an experience. He said, I was on board an ocean-going tug as a midshipman, and there was this battleship Wisconsin that went aground in the Hudson River. He said, I was amazed to learn later that, the CO went on to make admiral, and, nobody was held responsible for it. My father chuckled and said, yeah, that was me, and gave the details. So, it's amazing how those things crop up. In July of 1955, my father took command of a small destroyer of the USS Isabel. And for the previous 2 years, out of a squadron of 8 ships, Isabel had repeatedly placed last. So there were numerous challenges that my father faced as he took over command of the ship. But within 18 months, Isabel was first in the squadron. He was commended by the commander of Cruiser Destroyer Force's U.S. Pacific Fleet for winning the battle efficiency competition for his ship and excellence awards in engineering, gunnery, anti-submarine warfare, and operations. One of the things that kind of intrigued my father is, and again, he did all the analysis ahead of time to see what he needed to do to improve morale on board ship. But he said that he spent an inordinate amount of time on one element that seemed trivial, changing the ship's voice call sign. And in a message he sent up the chain of command, he said, quote, since recently assuming command of Isabel, this CO has been concerned over the anemic connotation of the present voice radio call sign when in company with such stalwarts as Fireball, Viper, and others. It is somewhat embarrassing and completely out of keeping with the quality of sailors aboard to be identified by the relatively ignominious title, Sackworth. That was their call sign. Nothing sexy about Sackworth. So they were able to get the name changed. Took 6 months to do it, but they got it changed to Help. Lot sexy. And so the sailors all got these patches put on showing a black cat, breaking a submarine. There was a book published many years ago, In Search of Excellence. Lessons from America's best-run companies were in the book, and there was a chapter entitled Productivity Through People. And it notes the important leadership trait of communication. It said, quote, Zumwalt revolutionized the Navy's personnel practices in just a few short years at the helm. It all stemmed from his simple belief that people respond well to being treated as grown-ups. He traces his beliefs back to an early command assignment. What I tried hardest to do was ensure that every officer and man on the ship not only knew what we were about, not only why we were doing each tactical evolution, however onerous, but also managed to understand enough about how it all fitted together that he could begin to experience some of the fun and challenge that those of us in the top slots were having. Our techniques were not unusual. We made frequent announcements over the loudspeaker about the specific event that was going on. At the beginning and end of the day, I discussed with the officers and in turn discussed with their men what was about to happen and what had just happened, what the competition was doing and what we should do to meet it. We published written notices in the plan of the day that would give the crew some of the color or human interest of what the ship was doing. I had bull sessions with the chief petty officer's quarters where I often stopped for a cup of coffee. More important than any of these details, of course, was the basic effort to communicate a sense of excitement, fun, and zest in all that we were doing, unquote. One of the people who was a junior officer on board the Isabel when my father came on board shared a story with me. He said that the previous CO of the ship had been quite a martinet, and they were waiting to see what kind of a leader my father would be. And about a week after each command of the ship, they went out on nighttime maneuvers with other ships. My father came up to the bridge, was observing what was going on, waited as long as he could, and then he said, "This is the captain, I have the comm." And a situation of extremis was developing, and the officer of the day, a junior officer, wasn't grasping what was happening. So basically my father was saying, "I now am driving the ship." He maneuvered the ship out of the way, and then everybody was holding their breath because they were sure that my father was going to unload on the officer of the deck. And he said, what my father did at that point in time was he turned back to the OD and he said, "This is the captain, I'm returning the comm to so-and-so." And he then went below decks. And this junior officer that shared the story with me said, it was obvious what he was doing there. He did not want to undermine the credibility of this OOD, nor for anybody on the bridge to think that he was unqualified. And by leaving that bridge and going down below decks, it showed everybody on that bridge, I still have confidence in this guy. He's a good man. Listen to him. I asked my father about the story. I said, wasn't that kind of difficult? He said, "Yeah, I didn't get any sleep that night." As a captain, my father became the executive assistant to Secretary of the Navy, Paul Nitze, and McNamara was defense secretary. Story I'll share there, that this was about the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And my father was at the Pentagon. He had just come out of the men's room, was walking back towards his office, and Secretary Nitze was coming the other direction. He grabs my father and says, "Secretary McNamara wants to see us." So my father was basically caught unprepared going into this meeting to go into McNamara's office. McNamara says, "Look, I want the following things done." And he starts listing these things, boom, 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 boom. And he looked up and he saw my father wasn't taking any notes. So he took a pad of paper and a pen and he threw it at my father's feet. My father didn't pick it up. And McNamara continued to go on and list these things. And so when he was finished, Secretary Nitze and my father left the office. My father immediately went back to his office, typed up everything McNamara wanted done, took it to the Secretary of the Navy. Secretary of the Navy read it over and said, "Looks like you got everything. McNamara told me if he forgets one thing, fire him." And what he didn't realize is that my father had an amazing photographic memory. I had personal experience with that. The excuses I came up for not doing my homework would only work once. So, in 1968, my father took command of all the naval forces in Vietnam. And he immediately put the Navy on a more active course, sending the forces out into the riverways to do patrols and so forth. He also set up a base called Seafloat, but that was basically a river base in the middle of a river. He was told by the Army that it would be impossible to defend. It turned out to be one of the best defended bases during the Vietnam War. And several of the tactics that he employed for the groundwater Navy that he commanded were subsequently used when we first went into Iraq and were operating on some of the Of the three wars my father fought, I asked him which one was the most difficult. And he said it was the Vietnam War, because in the other two wars, World War II and Korea, any orders he gave, he was going into harm's way, as well as all his sailors. Vietnam was the first time that he was telling others to go into harm's way, and he wasn't. And it bothered him. And so what he started doing was going out on patrols with the Navy patrol boats. General Abrams heard about this, read him the riot act, said, look, if you're killed, it's a big propaganda boost for the enemy, you're not to go out on those patrols anymore. But his men recognized the fact that he was willing to put himself in harm's way. As far as his becoming Chief of Naval Operations, I kind of have to reflect back on the story of Teddy Roosevelt and President McKinley. You may recall that McKinley's vice president had died in office, and so when he ran for a second term, the people in the party were concerned about Teddy becoming a political force and thought the best way to put him in a position where he wouldn't have much pull is to make him vice president. So he became vice president under McKinley, and then a few months later, McKinley was assassinated, and Teddy Roosevelt became president. Now that's comparable to what happened to my father. My father, as a two-star admiral in the Pentagon, was making waves. He was a systems analysis. He would call it as he saw it. He analyzed where the Navy was wasting money. And the Navy has three different schools. It has a submarine school, a surface school, and an aviator school. And each one tries to jockey to get its candidate put up for the CNO. And Admiral Moore, who, at the time was getting ready to be bumped up to the chairmanship of the JCS. So President Nixon started talking to candidates for his replacement. And interestingly, several months before my father was interviewed by Nixon, Secretary Dulles made D. Rusk made a trip out to Vietnam, and he was briefed by General Abrams as to what was going on, and then Abrams said, Mr. Secretary, I think it's important you talk to Admiral Zumwalt, who commands the Naval Force here, because he's doing some things that are really helping the war effort, and he started a program called Vietnamization, which was turning the war over to the Vietnamese. So Rusk met with my father and was impressed with him. And it turned out that Rusk's executive assistant was a friend of my father's, and he told my father that on his flight back to Washington, Rusk turned to him and said, look, when Moore's bumped up to chairman, let's look at Zumwalt as one of the candidates. So, here Moore had given my father the position in Vietnam because he really thought it was a dead-end job. Every admiral that had commanded the naval forces in Vietnam had retired. And so he thought that would mark my father's retirement, but it positioned him then to be promoted to the top spot. As far as his selection to CNO, regular third-classman Hammer wrote, quote, my immediate reaction was surprise, a happy surprise of someone falling heir to a small degree of vicarious fame that somehow lends credence to his own shared experiences, and yet no surprise. I was not surprised he had become the youngest Chief of Naval Operations in U.S. naval history. I figured he simply set his mind to it. It was merely a logical extension of my idea of what kind of a man he was. One other story I'd share with you about my father's character. When he commanded the naval forces in Vietnam, his Vietnamese counterpart was a fellow named Admiral Chong. And one of the big problems we had in Vietnam was that our advisors lacked the real respect that they should have given the South Vietnamese regulars. But my father treated Admiral Chong as an equal. Every decision he made on the battlefield, he brought in Admiral Chong to discuss it. The two of them became extremely close. Years later, when Saigon fell, my father was retired, but he managed to arrange for an aircraft to come in to take Admiral Chan and his family out of Vietnam before it fell to the North Vietnamese. Admiral Chan had assembled his family. He had 7 kids, and I think 4 or 5 of them were there. Plus he had his parents who were in their 80s. And he got the call, the plane is ready, you need to come now. He looked over at his parents, and they were crying. Vietnam had been the only country they had known, and it was difficult for them to leave. So he realized he couldn't leave, and he told the caller, send the plane elsewhere, we're not going. He knew the consequences of that decision, and he was eventually captured along with 2 of his sons who had served in the Army. They were released from education camps after 3 and 5 years. Admiral Chan for 12 years. The whole time he was there, my father worked with the International Red Cross attempting to get him out. And finally, after 12 years, he was released, but then for 3 more years, he was not allowed to leave Vietnam. Eventually, he made it to the U.S., where most of his family had managed to make it as well. And among greeting him was my father. To show you how close that relationship was, when my father was dying in December of 1999, I was calling Admiral Chan regularly to give him updates. And the day my father passed, the morning he passed, I dialed Admiral Chan's number. And he said, Admiral, this is Jim. And he said, your father died, didn't he? I was amazed. How did he know? And he said, last night I had a dream. Your father and I were on the ship. The ship was sinking. And your father pushed me through the door. And when I reached back to pull him through, he waved me off and closed the door. You know, you have to have an extremely strong bond to have that sense of perception. And that showed you how close these 2 men were. They were brothers in arms. Admiral Chan lived to be almost 100 years old, passed away about 2 or 3 years ago, but he kept in his home a picture of my parents. Perhaps the most challenging thing my father had occur came 9 years after his 1974 retirement, when my older brother Elmer, who had served in Vietnam on swift boats, was diagnosed with lymphoma. And usually when you have lymphoma, you either have Hodgkin's lymphoma or non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He was one of maybe a dozen medical cases in history that had both. It was linked to his exposure to Agent Orange. And ironically, the man who ordered the spraying of Agent Orange in Vietnam was my father. When he started increasing the naval operations in Vietnam, because these boats were operating in narrow waterways with heavy vegetation on the banks, you stood a 72% chance of being killed or wounded during a 1-year tour. My father felt that was unacceptable, and so the Army was using Agent Orange to defoliate around the fire bases. He had his staff check with the chemical companies who assured him there were no harmful effects to humans. He started using it, and the casualty rate dropped from 72% to 6%. So from a military standpoint, it made a lot of sense to use it, but what we didn't know is that our veterans were returning with time bombs ticking away inside. And we lost my brother in 1988. I'd like to share with you part of the last letter my brother wrote my father. Dear Dad, I saw the tears in your eyes as you read the letters I left the family. I know more than anything I wrote, it was the helpless desperation and agony as death approached someone you loved that caused those tears. referring to his family, he says, "I also know you continue to help us with your spirit for our sake. You made a difference. You lightened our burden. Both in Vietnam and with my cancers, we fought battles. We fought battles and lost. Yet we always knew, even when the battle was clearly desperate, that our love could not be compromised, and that however bad the odds, we were incapable of giving up. After my death, your strong, burning torch of love, which only death extinguished from my being, will light Maya, Russell, and Kathy. How I loved you. How I would have loved to continue to fight the battles by your side. You always made a difference. You made my last battle, the journey to death, more gentle, more humane. I love you." Mom. So I still can't read that without a little teary-eyed. Kind of a bad image for a Marine. My father said that, when he was in command of the naval forces in Vietnam, he went out of his way to make sure that he never showed any favoritism down. And he said his one regret was there was one thing he did. And he said that every day when he got the casualty list, he would start reading at the bottom up, because he knew if my brother had been killed or wounded, he would have been the last name on the list. After my father died, I went through all his files. He was dedicating them to the Vietnam Center at Texas Tech University. And two things that were kind of ironic. I came across a story he wrote as a midshipman at the Naval Academy called The Greek Horatius, a timely story of modern Greece with a smashing surprise element, written in 1940, in which he based it on the invasion of Greece by Italy. And in this story, he talked about a bridge that needed to be crossed by the advancing Italian army, and the Greeks needed to destroy it. But just as they were getting ready to destroy it, there was a wagon filled with munitions coming across the bridge, and the sniper had to take out the driver, even though he was on the same side, and blow up the munitions in order for it to blow up the bridge. And as he focused in on the driver, he recognized the driver as his own son. And I thought it was ironic, here in 1940, my father wrote a short story about a father playing a role in the fate of his son. And nearly a half century later, he would have the same role in my brother's fate. The other thing I came across were a number of letters that my parents exchanged shortly after they were married. And my mother was pregnant with my brother, and my father was at sea, and he was hoping to get information as to when the baby was born. And he wrote a letter dated July 31st, 1946. And my brother incidentally was born July 30th. And in the letter he said, I'm still waiting to hear whether or not Elmo has been born. If he hasn't been born, I hope he'll be born on my good luck day, August 13th. I never knew why it was a good luck day for my father, but ironically, August 13th was the day my brother died. So again, one of those strange things that happened going through his files. After retirement, my father got actively involved in a number of pro bono efforts. He was the one man responsible for getting veterans benefits for Agent Orange exposure. And he did a pro bono study on Agent Orange, which was able to show how a number of the medical studies were flawed. He also found out that the medical board that every 3 years would review the evidence on Agent Orange to see whether or not there was a correlation between it and various cancers was comprised mostly of doctors who worked for the chemical companies. So, they kind of had a bias. But he suggested they be disbanded and a totally independent board be established. My father recommended over 24 cancers that he felt there was evidence that showed there was a correlation. The first board determined that 3 of those cancers should be compensated for, and They, every 3 years, have reviewed the list, and now they're up to about 15 or 18 of those cancers. My father hoped he would have lived long enough to see all of them recognized, but I know he's happy with the progress. In 1998, Clinton presented the nation's highest civilian honor, the Medal of Freedom, to my father for his changes to improve life in the Navy and for the belief of the commander's responsibility to courageous men under him after the guns of the battlefield fell silent. As I said, President Clinton gave a eulogy at my father's funeral, and he said that when he first met my father introduced himself as a former sailor, and Clinton said that's like Henry Ford calling himself a former car salesman. Clinton also said that he felt that my father was the conscience of the Navy. The day that Clinton was getting dressed to go to my father's funeral, there was a Filipino Navyman there who was helping him get his attire lined up, and he told the president, "He's the best we ever had. He was for us." Clinton said of my father, quote, "Americans could always count on Bud Zumwalt to do the right thing. He sailed through rough waters more than once. When we struggled through the racial tensions of the 60s and 70s, he worked in the face of wilting criticism and a highly resistant institutional culture to make the Navy do the right thing and make the Navy one of the most colorblind institutions in our entire nation. I know it was a special point of pride for him that the very first African-American admiral earned his star on Bud Zumwalt's watch. At a time when morale and enthusiasm were at an all-time low, he had the vision to see a great future for the Navy. He was truly a sailor's admiral." One other story I want to share with you, and then I'll wrap up here. I'm sorry it kept you so long. But, when you're talking about somebody as great as my father was, it's hard to stop talking. I mentioned to you that my father had a great sense of humor, and going through his files, I came across a 3-page letter from an attorney from down south. And this guy was, this letter was written about a month before my father retired. And it was obviously for somebody who was very upset with the way my father had run the Navy. He said, "Admiral, I was happy to hear that you're retiring. You're a disgrace to the Navy. You've maximized the interest of the minorities to the detriment of the majorities," and just went on and on and on. Just seething by the time I got to reading it, until I read my father's one-sentence response. And it said, "Dear Mr. Jones, please be advised some nut has written me a letter and signed your name to it." There was no response from that. And my father is buried at the Naval Academy, and despite all his accolades, the only thing he wanted on his tombstone was the word reformer. And for my mother, 2 words, his strength. In 2008, I was at Bath Iron Works, and for the commissioning of the USS Stockdale. And while I was there, they took me over to show me the first piece of steel received to be put into the USS Zumwalt. And I'm sure to the workers there at the shipyard, that piece of steel didn't mean much to them. But seeing that piece of metal meant a lot to me about the metal of the man that it represented. He was a remarkable man, and I have no doubt in my mind that when Zumwalt was at sea, there were 2 patron saints looking over the ship and its crew, the patron saints of sailors, Admiral Angelos. Thank you.
Thank you enough. What a very moving and learning talk. Thank you very much, James, Lieutenant Colonel James Zumwalt. Now, we've set up a tradition here audience to ask some questions, and James is going to have to answer them. I will not answer any of them. Mike Tieman's going to put that camera on you, and so you think about a question or two. He covered from about 1939 all the way till, I guess, 2000. So during that 61-year period of time, I think you could think of a question or two. We'll have 2 microphones, and Colonel Zumwalt will walk to where you are, let you ask a question. You're going to have to say who you are and what your name is, and then you have to ask a question or two. If there's no questions, that's fine. If there's some questions, we much prefer that. We're going to document that because all these things are interactions, and that's what we're going to do in the future. We're going to do what you call sharing. And this is the title of this is Learn, Lunch, and Share. So we got through the learn, we got through the lunch, now it's share. So James, if you'll come up front here, and I want a hand or two. If there's no hand or two, say, I've got a hand over here, and you're the next one over here. So you're going to have to stand up, ma'am, and you're going to have to turn around because the camera wants to see some beauty. Okay? And it's not me. No, now you got to turn around. The camera's behind you here, right here. And you identify yourself and around all the way. That's all right.
How do you think your father would appraise today's Navy?
Say your name.
Shirley Hitch.
The question is, how would your father appraise today's Navy? Well, that's not an easy question, Shirley. That's where I'm glad I don't have to answer that.
Well, when you say Navy, I'm going to take it from the perspective of the entire military. Because there's been a lot going on recently, both the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan and also this push to educate the military on critical race theory. I don't know how many of you are familiar with critical race theory. I read through it, and it is a disastrous thing to teach our troops. It teaches racial prejudice. It teaches the fact that every white person is born with animosity towards other races. And it builds from that. That's the last thing you want to inject into the military. In the Marine Corps, it was all about team effort. Black, white, whatever. We were a team, and we knew we depended on each other. We knew that our back was covered by the person to our right or left. Critical race theory breaks down the team concept. As far as the Afghanistan withdrawal, I am absolutely shocked that heads have not rolled on that. As a military person, you know the first people you want out are those that cannot defend themselves. American citizens, our allies, and then our military. We did it the complete reverse. I don't understand how any military person could do that. And we've heard from the testimony on Capitol Hill that the Defense Secretary, General Milley, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and others gave Biden the guidance that we should leave a force presence there, and he chose to disregard it. Well, if I were Milley or the Defense Secretary, I'd say, Mr. President, if you're not taking our advice and we're losing lives, I'm resigning my position. When my father was Chief of Naval Operations, and they had some of the race riots on the ships. He was called by Henry Kissinger, and Henry Kissinger said, I want you to get these guys, court-martial them, and give them dishonorable discharge. My father said, sir, that's an illegal order, and I'm not going to follow it. And he didn't. That's the kind of courage that you need to stand up to civilian authority. And I don't see any of that today. It saddens me to see it because it reflects on our military.
Okay, thank you. One of the things James talked about was he is Marine Corps, and there's a thing called Semper Fi, and Semper Fi means always faithful. And you've probably been in high school, most of you at some time, and you might have been on a football team or basketball team, and there's a little bit of Semper Fi there. But I used to take care of a lot of Marines, and they go to boot camp, and they come out of boot camp after 6 to 8 weeks. And sometimes because of a medical problem, at the 7th week, I'd have to take them out of their unit. And I've never seen such a horrible psychological experience when a person had 50 of the best friends he or she ever developed in their life, and they had to leave that unit. I had to take their heart out. I couldn't understand it at that time. But you don't ever find a unit like a Marine Corps unit that cares for each other's back. He's a Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel. He knows what I'm talking about. It took me many, many years to understand that. But it's really something that you don't see in civilization today, and it's the Semper Fi of the Marine Corps unit. But anyway, that's an aside. I have Earl Fetcher had a question, unless it's already been asked. Stand up and tell your name.
My name is Earl Fetcher, and question, I wonder how many in your family, you mentioned your brother, other family members, siblings?
I had the older brother who we lost, and then I have 2 younger sisters. As I mentioned too, I don't know whether I mentioned or not, but we have a family tradition of military service going back to the American Revolution. It was Jacob Zumwalt who served in the Revolutionary War. So we've gone 9 generations now with having a member of the family in just about every conflict that America has been involved in. My own son, he, after 9/11, got into the NRTC unit and wanted to serve his country. And partway through his term there, you have to decide whether you want to go Navy or Marine Corps. And so I was intrigued to see whether he decided to go Navy like his grandfather or Marine like his dad. Called me up and said, Dad, I made Dean's List. And I said, that's terrific, son, I'm proud of you. He said, yeah, but now I think I'm too smart to be a Marine. So I don't know if you remember Eddie Dangerfield, but I get no respect.
Hi, I'm Susie Hanson, and as they said before, I'm with the Daughters of the American Revolution. And my family's had somebody that volunteered, usually at a lower level, because they didn't want the expense of being an officer. Really true. But anyway, now, I wanted to thank you for speaking to us. My father served on the DD, I have to write it down, 594 in World War II, the Heart, and he also went to Shanghai and had dinners with Russians. And he always worried about what happened to them after the communist takeover, the ones that were there.
Well, my mother's parents were, her father was French, he was a fur trader, and her mother was Russian. They were living in Harbin, Manchuria, and then when the Bolsheviks took over, they were part of the white Russian community that went down to Shanghai. But years later, after my father retired, my parents got a chance to make a trip to Shanghai, and they said that it was hardly recognizable to see the white Russian community there. It either died off or else integrated, but it was no longer visible in Shanghai. Also, unfortunately, her mother's grave had been dug up, and the bodies that were in that cemetery and placed elsewhere were disposed of. So it was a sad return for her.
Thank you. I put, stand up here, I put Mr. Brett Holt on the stage. He didn't offer a question, but he's CB, and he can, and we'll ask Lieutenant Colonel Zumwalt a little bit about CBs. I'm sure his question will be directed that way, but Brian's been a grade school, high school friend of mine. He's been helping out a lot with
Brian Redhold. Thank you, Mark. Dr. Brennan. The Seabees are the construction corps of the Navy, and we work directly supporting the Marines. And we go through a whole lot of the same stuff the Marines go through. That's why we say hoorah, just like the Marines do. We are brothers in arms to them, and they are brothers in arms to us, and we'll do anything possible we can to support them. And we know that they've always got our back. We've never had a problem with that. We're always protected. Did your dad come up with the idea of the Z-grams because he really wanted to communicate throughout the forces in order to make sure everybody was educated on the direction the Navy was going to go and the Marines?
My father's experiences in the Navy had shown him that one of the biggest problems was communication, and that there would be commanding officers in the chain of command that would give things their own spin or ignore them or whatever. And my father felt the only way to get around that was to make sure that the sailors at the lowest level got the word directly from him. This is what the regulations are. This is the way it will be. And that upset a lot of the old guard because they felt that it was circumventing their authority. But it really was the only way that you could get the word down to the lowest echelon. And your comment about the Seabees, they were fantastic. A great group. The bond between the two groups was fantastic. Marines were just a lot better looking. But that's just my independent.
There any other questions here from the House? I've got one of the gentlemen here that I'm trying to get to talk. His name's John Bishop, and he was in Vietnam, and he can't hear, but maybe you hear what I just said. But he's back in his some of his uniform and some of his paraphernalia from Vietnam, and back in the cabinet back there along with Mr. Bill B. Schuster. But can you just ask Colonel Zumwalt a question?
Were you there? Were you there when Westmoreland was in charge?
No, I wasn't. Abrams was in charge.
The question, the question was he in charge? Was he there when Westmoreland was there? Westmoreland
Was my father there? Are you asking if my father was?
Was General Westmoreland there when you were there, Colonel Zumwalt?
No, General Abrams was.
So Abrams took over from Westmoreland about 68 or...
Yeah, I forget the exact time frame.
Yeah.
I think he was there like 7 years. I was there in 68, 69. And I was in the Marines, but we was definitely under him. So I don't remember when he left country or not. I know he finally got relieved sometime in the early 70s, but I can't remember who took his place.
It was General Abrams that replaced him. And as I recall, I think my father actually was there for a little part of Westmoreland's tour, and then Abrams came in.
Okay, I don't see anybody asking other questions. There's a book up on the front there that's written by, hold that up there, Jim, if you don't mind. That's written about his dad and his brother, written by James himself. And there's another book. Can you hold the other book up? Donna Bowen bought these 3 books. The book's upstairs. This is about Vietnam. It's very well written. It's written by James Zumwalt. So it's on Amazon or wherever you want to buy one. I recommend them. They're really well written, both of them. So
Just one quick story about this book about my father and brother. My brother, it was published before he died, and he called me one day to say, well, we have a title for the book. It's My Father, My Son. And I said jokingly, well, I thought I was going to be in the title. He said, well, then we'd have to, My Father, My Son, My Ass. So, a little bit of family rivalry.
Okay, thank you all for coming today. Now, don't run up right away. Okay, this similar thing happens on 11/4/2021. We'll have a stage here. We'll have 3 99-year-olds on the stage talking about their experiences during World War II. Very rare to have that happen. It's going to be Irv Levine. He was in the Hump. He was radio man over in the Hump. Alan Sanderson flew 118 missions in Italy and over in Europe in the B-47. And then the third one is Dr. John Bender, who was probably in medical school and a cadet during that time. So we'd love to have you during that time. And Donna Bone has something else that she wants to say.
I just want to let everybody know, for those of you who have grandkids, on Halloween, which is on Sunday this year, we're open from 12 to 4, we're having a Halloween bash. So that includes a scavenger hunt for the kids. We have 15 questions, and they have to find the answers, but it's going to be easy because we're going to have a skeleton where all the answers can be found. They'll get a treat for filling out the form, and then we'll also have face painting. Kids 5 and under are free. 6 to 12, $5, so we have special pricing that day. And then, of course, anyone older than 12 is the standard $11 fee. So hope bring your grandkids out here.
So that's Halloween, the 31st. The other thing is there's a sign-up sheet for 11/4. My wife, I don't want her halo to grow any bigger than it is. So I'm getting that halo's hitting me too many times. So if you sign up, then the halo doesn't grow bigger. Because I'm getting hit too many times at the halo. But anyway, sign up if you see the sheet. It should have been passed around. That's for 11/4, so she doesn't have to talk to all of you on the phone. She likes to talk to you, but you're a little bit big crowd. James, got one more thing to say.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to thank Don Gillis for Don standing in the back. He's with Habitat for Humanity, and just because of my friendship with Don, I found out about this group and got the invitation to speak. So Don is former Army, so we have our little competition here. Did I speak slow enough today for you to understand, Don?
But Don is the one that talked to us about getting James here, so we have to take our hat off to Don, and he's going to change. He's also going to paint his car yellow because he's been the taxi cab for James, and so if you need a ride, he's also a good driver, I think. So now, before you leave, I want you to look at these Vietnam exhibits, and back of the museum we have the simulator, and Mr. Yeager, not Chuck Yeager, but Richard Yeager, will teach you. And if you like to go back there, you get 10 minutes of flying, and then bring your grandkids out, or your nephews and nieces, or even your kids, or your parents, and they can learn too. Thank you very much.